It's more than just the actual security of supply. It's about its affordability to the economy and to the general consumers who actually consume it. But there is also a bigger component to it, which is about sustainability. It is about socio-economic sustainability as well. So I actually see energy security as having three distinct components which form a cube, which is price, sustainability, and supply. But how, as rightly pointed out, how different countries sit is different. For instance, Norway, with vast amounts of water resources and hydrocarbon potential, sees energy security very differently from Saudi Arabia with oil. And also it depends on the type of economy you have.
Energy security is also a factor of the global sentiment around climate change. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges facing development in Africa, is that coming as a primary resource environment, being able to leverage that birthright in an environment where there is significant pressure on emissions reduction initiatives and concerns around growth in energy consumption. The reality, particularly in Africa, is that as people rise out of poverty, the demand for energy is going to increase. And we've seen across all different jurisdictions that there is a direct correlation between an increase in demand for energy, an increase in demand for emissions. And as poverty decreases, the demand for energy on a per capita basis increases. So security in the global consideration also is important because it affects local competitiveness, which has an impact on economic growth and particularly employment.
Two areas for me that's quite important. Number one is for capital or for business. It's quite important to, number one, sweat your current assets. In terms of energy security, the industry in South Africa currently is really struggling to sweat its assets. It's because there's already an issue with security of supply in terms of all the things that the other speakers said. It's about volatility of price, volatility of availability of electricity. And therefore, industry in a developing country like South Africa, where we need to create jobs and we need to address the education issues in the country. The problem is to start up new business is virtually impossible if you can't sweat your current assets. So the whole issue of putting money into creating new businesses becomes a problem. If you then look at the people on the ground, we've got massive education issues in the region, poverty issues, and that can also only be resolved by energy security as a starting point. And then it's interesting that energy security also has got the word security in it, because if your neighbor doesn't have access to energy and you have, your neighbor is gonna come to you for energy, and that's what's happening in the region, and we need to address that all over Africa to ensure energy security.
I think that in the energy space, that's something that's worth discussing first. Whether the pure market forces in the energy industry is healthy, particularly because of its importance to economic growth and particularly development. Our view is that the pure market environment is probably not ideal in this country. But I think the reality of the situation is structures and intervention need to be effective to enable confidence, to enable access to energy when it's required. And I think the challenges we now see is this issue of nimble decision making impacts economic growth. In other words, economic growth right now is constrained by lack of power. I mean, the large users are suffering significant power cuts. I mean, we talk about the lights being staying on, but I mean that's really just in the media eye. We're seeing the smelters being load shed on a regular basis. We're seeing large industrials being paid to shut down productive capacity, and I think that's something that is not really well known. Is that South Africa is under immense power constraints at the moment, and it has an economic impact.
I think the demand is there, and I think it's really suppressed in terms of supply. That's where the issue is. So from an independent power producer, we've got no issue about the demand. The demand is there. And now I'm only speaking about South Africa. Then outside of South Africa, north of our borders, we've got massive problems in terms of power supply. And you can see projects going up in Mozambique, in Botswana, in Namibia, and everywhere else, because the countries north of South Africa has realized they cannot rely on South Africa anymore for energy security.
You know, I think we have a shortfall of power of the order of about 6,000 megawatts currently in the country. This shortfall is only being made up currently by the Eskom new build. And the Eskom new build is running late at the moment, and it's late because we started planning late. Now, what's important to understand in large-scale power generation is if you haven't planned in a 10-year window, you're late. If you miss the boat in the 10-year window, you're already late. We knew in '97 that we're going to be late and we're going to be short of power in 2007. The contracts for these large power stations were placed in 2006, almost 9 years late into the window. The other question we need to answer is, we have to make up the deficit as fast as possible because it's leading to economic suppression on a scale of hundreds of billions per annum. I mean, this is a reality. If we want economic growth, we have to increase the power supply. And the economic growth is so crucial to the job creation and the prosperity of the economy. So from independent power producers' perspective, we need a regulatory environment that will give us the freedom to be able to make those investments and make up the deficit. We're late again on planning baseload capacity. So we're late on nuclear, we're late on coal again, and so we're just repeating the cycle. The other important aspect is you've got to get the planning right. When we did the planning in the 80s and the 90s and started building these large power stations, we ended up with excess capacity because our expectation of what the demand was optimistic. This is a game that requires long-term planning, huge amounts of capital, but you need to get the planning right. And right now we have to make up a deficit. And this deficit of 6,000 megawatts currently is an issue we need to deal with. But we have a regulatory environment that is not being friendly towards making that up from independent power producers.
Napoleon, when talking about battle, he says, you know, I'll lose territory any day. I'll make it up. But time, you can't make up time. And that's the issue that we face as a country. And every panel I sit on and every conference that we go to, we hear about the issue of timing and planning. And that deals with the environment and the regulatory environment that you spoke of. You know, things are moving. We've seen great reform within the sector. You see parliamentary committees, you see bills before Parliament and so on, but there's always an awkward dance. It doesn't necessarily seem to really quite gel. So when you're watching that dance floor, yes, things are happening, but it's really it's not as nice as you'd like to see. And I think possibly more engagements like we're having today, persons coming together, entities coming together and talking hopefully with one voice will move an environment that we need to see. Transmission is also a very big issue for ourselves. If you ask a developer, there are 3 concerns for a developer, and no order of preference. It'll be transmission, transmission, and transmission. So that too is a big elephant in the room waiting to be spoken about. So back to your question about the regulatory environment, it's happening. Is it happening as fast as we want to? Listening to Doug, probably no. Is there work on it? Yes. Is it appropriate? Partly. So it's a mixed answer to something that's really vitally important for the economy.
For me, energy is an economic infrastructure. It's no different from any other infrastructure. Unfortunately, with energy, is that it drives demand, but it is dependent on the same demand. So, and the last thing you want to do is to constrain the growth by constraining the supply of energy. So you have got to be, in the planning side, you've got to be able to predict what the demand should be and kind of provide it before it is needed with the view that it will be needed. However, coming to the mining side, for instance, if it's something that is unaffordable, is it available? Because the fact that you provided it, but if it's at a price, let's just take one particular type smelter that I know mostly about, the chrome smelters. If you have electricity that's available to them at a rand per kilowatt hour for smelting of chrome, it is not available. So the issue around, for instance, when we ask the question, therefore, where are the bottlenecks? I think the first challenge is, and let's get a clear understanding of the role played by electricity in this economy. There is clear demand, historic demand, which has been defined. It's household demand, it's commercial demand, it's an industrial demand. A lot of that demand can be met by historical ways, and a lot of those historical ways, some of the plants are getting old. By 2025, for instance, we're going to start replacing a whole fleet of Eskom plants. That's replacing the current demand. You can replace it with old ways or new ways. But there is this part for me where you're now saying, if you understand your true role of your own energy in your own economy, you then start saying, energy is about monetizing your own resources, We have solar resources in Africa. We're not monetizing it, but it's a resource. You're sitting with Congo, for instance, sitting with water that runs down every day into the sea. If you can believe the estimates made of 20,000 megawatt potential at even 3 US cents per day, you can just see the amount of money that's going to the sea every day in the Congo. But if you understood the role energy could play potentially in the Congo, where if you had the electricity, the whole of electricity provided at an affordable price in the Congo, we could leverage that 100 times more. So what I'm saying, I guess, to answer you, is that for me, it starts with a real understanding of what the role of energy is in your economy. If you are developing, or if you're a developed economy, it's very, very different. It cannot be the same.
I think it comes back to an important point that Greg started on, and the client has mentioned now, is this issue of if we are to become a more planned economy, in other words, there's greater state intervention, the first thing we require is policy coherence. We can't have, on one hand, DTI saying our role for economic growth in the future is massive beneficiation. On the other hand, we have Department of Environmental Affairs and National Treasury looking at imposing carbon taxes and emissions constraints on that, which really just forces up price, which makes beneficiation impossible. So policy incoherence also creates this environment where we have this uncoordinated dance floor. We have parties doing waltzes and jigs and all together and bumping into each other, and that's one of our biggest problems. Is we aren't looking at it holistically and saying, this is where we need to take our economy to create those jobs. This is the energy resources we have. How do we leverage that?
Well, I think each entity or person involved in this planning process or department wants it to happen, but as Sean actually says, it's the coordination of that.
I think a lot of to do with politics. If you look at infrastructure and general infrastructure, let's talk about transmission, distribution, roads, dams. It's normally in South Africa and parts of Africa state-owned, and there's nothing wrong with that. We've seen in the last few years toll roads becoming something of in the landscape, and a lot of these toll roads. Excluding the last one, that there's a lot of issues around the e-toll, but people drive on those roads every day and they pay their toll, and it's public-private partnerships. So if it can work on the roads, why can't it work in transmission? Let the state and Eskom focus on building the backbone and the infrastructure in terms of the transmission grid, and let the independents come in with the generation capacity. I'm talking about coal, wind, solar, all the gas, all of that. So because we can really bring in a lot of foreign investment into the country by doing that. And there's a lot of money in Europe and the US in pension funds locked up that's looking for returns. At this stage, IPPs don't even have access to the national grid, except for the renewable energy program. The Eskom is spending a lot of money on Medupi and Kusile, at much more than should have happened, and the independents are there to step into that space. So I think in terms of comparative advantage, it would be great for the state, through its state-owned enterprises, to really focus on transmission and give access to the independents, and let the independents bring the generation capacity to the table with private money and with international money.
I think we must just be careful about working around the problem. You know, the lack of investment in transmission and distribution environment merely comes down to failure from the regulator. The regulator's job is to make sure that that's done. I think if we had a capacitated, effective, and aggressive regulator, a lot of these problems wouldn't be here. So, you know, it's no use discussing problems to strip things away and create structures and stuff when we need to fix the issue that exists right now. I mean, if we look at the municipal tariffs, they're running out of control. I mean, NERSA is not doing very much in controlling those. Investment in distribution infrastructure is failing. NERSA is not taking away any licenses. There is no pressure from NERSA for the entities that have licenses to perform.
If you look at the biggest electricity trader in the world, Nord Pool, the transmission network is owned by government. But the regulator sits on it. It must guarantee 100% availability of this thing. And there are serious hefty fines that are imposed on that entity if it doesn't. Competition must be in terms of production. There is the market, there are people who can produce electricity. The issue is the building of the freeway in between. It makes the projects not viable. What it also does, that some smaller mines that could have potentially been able to produce are handicapped because they might not have the capacity to actually build a road. IPPs, they might have the capability and the muscle to build power plants. Regulator that imposes fines if that is not done. To be able to produce gas somewhere and link it to its potential market, you've got to go through some states. You need to do certain things. Can that happen in Africa? I think that's a challenge.
One of the issues that we need to deal with is, if you look at the structure of the South African economy, if you have a percentage growth, you can say, I'm going to add so many thousand megawatts per annum to the supply. That enables you to do what you need to do to invest the money to build that capacity. But put 1,000 megawatts up in Namibia. Have to transport the excess to some off-taker who will help you securitize that project. In countries where your chunks of demand are small in comparison to the economy, you then need the transmission network to export the excess, but you need to securitize those offtakes. So the issues that we face is there are these sources of rather friendly electricity production, but somebody has to take the risk of plonking the project on the ground and selling that to off-takers, and those off-takers need to make commitments. And the issues we face is, in order to make that size of investment, you need off-takers to commit to taking that power. And that's why Grand Inga is an idea. Because, and I can give you an example, we only built 2 transmission lines to the Moselle smelter in Mozambique. And we formed an independent transmission company in order to transfer the power from South Africa to the Moselle smelter. 28 legal agreements had to be put in place. The project was operating for 2 years and the last agreements were not signed. So if you look at the transactional complexity of doing something like that, if you start in Congo, they speak French. You come through Angola, they speak Portuguese. You come through Namibia, you come through Botswana, and then you get the power to South Africa. The complexity of putting that transactional structure together is enormous. So what we see as technical possibilities must also be workable in a commercial sense. And so when we had excess electricity in this country, Eskom was one of the biggest drivers of the Southern African power pool because we needed a means to distribute the excess electricity. And for a long time, we supplied our neighbors. That has now come to an end. I mean, we are now shutting our neighbors' supply down because we don't have enough in South Africa. But in order to use the sources of power generation, we need a power network, but we also need off-takers that can secure putting in the investment for those power plants. So that's an issue we face. The issue we face is there may be very good power hydro resources north of us, but we've got to play in a pool. We've got to securitize that offtake, otherwise the project will never happen. Because those local economies just don't have sufficient demand to put such large capacity on the ground.
talking about a regional cooperation of supply of energy needn't necessarily just relate to the state's involvement. We can have private stakeholder, without leaving aside the market. And I think looking at the African continent would be ridiculous, quite frankly, just to talk about private and about the market. The state has to have the involvement as to where we are developing as an economy. We've got to have a strong regulator. We've got to have a strong ref. And to that end, we've got to ensure that that institution, because the greatest threat for us as a country at the moment are challenges against institutions. So anything that we create and anything that we build has to be ensured that it's absolutely strong. And for that reason, I think, as Sean rightly points out, NERSA has to be strengthened. I don't mind transmission lines necessarily, or the grid company being under government or Eskom, as long as that ref that is controlling the game is strong and fair.
Totally agree. And if you look at what's happening in Africa, it's already happening this week. I think the Western Corridor transmission system is being opened. That means it's already being commissioned. It's operating probably. So there's good stories coming through. I think if you look at the Southern African Power Pool, great. I mean, well designed. The same system that North Pool is being operated by SAP. I mean, it's an excellently designed system. The issue is, if I've got an IPP plant somewhere in South Africa, I cannot access SAP. I'm at this stage prevented to do that because of policy and regulatory uncertainties. So if I want to sell electricity as a South African IPP to a company in Zimbabwe that doesn't have access to electricity, I cannot. And that's where we need to solve the issues. I see the Southern African Power Pool as really the vehicle to unlock the problems. At this stage, the power pool is actually owned by a lot of utilities. And the power pool is a trading platform where you can trade over the day-ahead market or so, but I can't go and fund an IPP project by project finance by saying I'm going to sell over the day-ahead market. So if we can get a balance sheet behind Southern African Power Pool to stand in for PPAs, we're going to solve the problem. Eskom started the power pool to actually export power. So why can't we integrate the power pool and Eskom's transmission grid into a separate multi-state-owned entity? You can even bring privates into it, 30% of that, but bring new money in. Bring state money to the transmission system, integrate the South African system and the Southern African Power Pool, give access to independence, and we solve a lot of the problems. There's a study being done by the World Bank. Can't remember the figures, but I think it's 2 US cents per kilowatt hour that the electricity price will come down just by integrating the area and enabling the Southern African Power Pool to be used in the region, because you can drive economies of scale and comparative advantage.
You know, the issue of cooperation, I think, is critical. I mean, we talk about the simple solutions to unlock electricity transmission across the, just do power pool or whatever. But the reality is, if you look at the issue that the Road Freight Association face, I mean, 40 different forms to just cross a single border. I mean, those roads exist, the demand exists, the supply exists, yet the cooperation is not there. So we have to realize that to cooperate, we're all slightly worse off, but we're not as worse off as if we didn't cooperate. That's the fundamental thing. And I think the first thing is this discussion around creating regional cooperation, creating closer regional integration. And that requires some, I suppose, leadership in putting aside personal requirements over regional requirements. So creating structures is really not going to solve the issue until people can cooperate.
Well, I guess the solution might lie in some kind of an energy treaty. And the examples, we have some things called 3-country rule. So we can't pick up product in one country via another country to drop off in another country. Why? I mean, we have a lot of these things in Africa that prevent trade, prevent the actual coordination. Absolutely. But in terms of energy infrastructure, until we have an energy infrastructure treaty, we must treat that energy infrastructure as the canals, the water canals that are linking demand and supply, and it must be governed. You can't, for instance, have a pipeline tariff of 5 cents per liter in a particular part of the country, and then when it goes into another country, it goes to 10. It doesn't work that way. So therefore, the challenge we're facing in Africa is going to be to actually make these projects happen. In South Africa, the only other cross-border pipeline that has happened is the pipeline from Mozambique to South Africa. And I'd like to venture to say that the only reason why it happened is because you had one player who happened to be both on the production side, Sasol, who co-owns the actual infrastructure and also provides demand. So we need to have an energy treaty, something that is, it sits at an AU level, which is going to be, it's the governance structures are the same, whatever, that treats energy infrastructure as like those water canals.
But I agree with the word champion. I think that's what's needed. And I think we recognize and acknowledge that that's something that works. The difficulties, of course, is that we do have. I mean, if you just looked at our president's trip to Angola a couple of years ago, the biggest issue on the table was visas. You know, the World Economic Forum a couple of years back in Tanzania, the biggest issue on the table was that we need 2 passports for one person to travel from one part of the continent to the other because of the visas required. And if we've got problems at that level, it can be very difficult to champion a network that's absolutely vital to have to alleviate poverty. So we've got our challenges cut out for ourselves, but not to say that it can't happen.
When we had excess power, the Southern African power pool was functioning absolutely beautifully. People were supplying power to each other whenever there was excess power. They could wheel it through the Southern African power pool. The power pool, really, its activities have been curtailed because you've got a 40,000 megawatt utility called Eskom, and they actually made a lot of things happen over there. But when the power dried up over here, the activities of the pool also dried up because there isn't much excess to wheel around anymore. And from the independent power producers' perspective, one of the keys that we need, and you can check in all successfully operating independent grids in the world, that the independence of the grid and access to the grid is a key to making that development work. The other thing, you need clear and cogent policy that can be implemented. If there's confusion in the policy, then the whole implementation side becomes even more confused. Let me give you an example. The Primary Electricity Act in South Africa at the moment, which is the ERA, Electricity Regulation Act of 2006, it's been amended. There's a second amendment awaiting passage through Parliament. I then have an ISMO bill, but the primary bill does not even mention the ISMO. We have the issues of wheeling. The Primary Act doesn't even use the word wheeling. So what you've got is policy making that's unclear in terms of the electricity landscape out there. And that gives rise to confusion in implementation, gives rise to confusion in regulation. And so we have an opportunity in this country to get it right, but our policy making is actually poor.
I don't think our policy making is incorrect. I think our implementation is often suboptimal. Well, we design some policies, they aren't implemented, so they're not delivering the return. So we, instead of fixing them, we create new policy. So, I mean, as business, we inundate it with policy, with calls for comment, with regulatory reform, with calls for changes. You know, the issue is start with the basics and get it right. You know, we have NERSA. Instead of creating ISMOs and new transmission companies and different structures, fix the regulator, and then we wouldn't have half the problems.
We've actually, quite frankly, got fantastic stories across the continent. If you look at the Mozambican gas finds, the Tanzanian gas finds, the oil in Uganda, the program which has been feted around the world is our South African IPP program that's running at the moment. These are great, great stories. The bottom line, Brian, is as Sean's now basically saying, the dance floor is full. It gets to strike the right chord, to get the right band, get the right music to play. That's the bottom line. That's where we are at the moment. So we've got plenty out there to work with. The future is good, but it's hard to construct it in a way which is harmonious.
I think the reality is that you get this issue of important versus urgent. I think it is very urgent to get that puzzle The problem we've got is that we're trying to build the puzzle without the box, but while the lights are off. So that makes it extremely difficult. And unfortunately, the decisions that were made in the late 90s and early 2000s regarding capacity led to a situation where we now have everything that we do are overshadowed by the lack of access to electricity. What happens then is any decision maker needs to balance urgency and importance. And that's the problem. So if you go back to what happened in South Africa when Jacob Zuma became president, the first thing he's done is to create the Department of Energy. So the Department of Energy is probably 4 years old. It's a total new department. And electricity and energy issues were then taken out of Eskom and given to the Department of Energy. In these 4 years, we've seen tremendous progress. And a hell of a lot of good stories. For instance, we were at the African Energy Forum in Berlin last week, or the week before that, and the CEO of Globalic, it's one of the successful IPPs in Africa, commended the South African government with the renewable energy program and said, his specific words were that the best renewable energy program in the developing world. And because he's Norwegian, I think he didn't say the world, but it is definitely one of the best out there. So the good stories are there, and I think the point that you made is we must start communicating those good stories. There's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of working together at the moment, but unfortunately, in terms of the urgent lack of access to electricity now, it does cloud issues and it does cloud decision making, and building the long-term vision becomes more difficult because of that.
On Tommy's good note of hope and good news, there's a lot of good news in our country and a lot of good news within the region, and I suppose it's getting the balance right. It's getting that harmony. So that's our challenge, and it's not something that we are not up for.
I think in conclusion, I think if a lot of the issues that we raised here can be quickly dealt with a strengthened, capacitated, and strong regulator, because then I think we will have licensees being held to their conditions. We will have a much greater control over the price path, which I think is a significant concern for economic growth going into the future, the price path for electricity. And I think we can address a lot of the concerns that IPPs have, as opposed to trying to address it through a market structure by having a fair referee. I think a lot of those concerns for structural change will also disappear.
I think for me, first is to acknowledge that it's easy to talk about problems. What's difficult is coming up with solutions. But I agree with you. I mean, the solutions are out there. I think the challenge in South Africa is firstly is the coherence of those solutions. You can't have Department of Trade and Industry coming up or the economic development going in one path, and the infrastructure company, the infrastructure departments that are supposed to be supporting that going on a different path. You need a coherence of policy making. The key issue, though, for me, is about stamina and endurance to be able to implement the decisions you've taken. If we are saying that the private sector is going to build the generation capacity and the state is going to transmit that, let's live through that vision. But let's see it through. Let's not change in the middle, because when we do the change, we confuse everybody and nothing gets done. So for me, it's about coherence and it's about stamina to see through the decisions we take. It's not just within the Department of Energy, but coherence of all government policies. Let's go one direction.
I just want to put down a couple of bullet points just to get the focus right. If we value economic growth in this country as the highest priority, and we want the jobs to be created, then we've got to fix up this deficit in electricity. The best analogy I can give you is that the patients had a heart attack. Now, if you've got someone who's had a myocardial infarct, and you're sitting there telling him about a long-term plan to reduce his cholesterol, the patient's going to die. You want to have the defibrillator at your side, and you want to revive the patient, and when he's stabilized, you can then tell him, here's the long-term plan to reduce your cholesterol. Our power situation is almost the same. We have a deficit It is suppressing economic growth in this country to the tune of hundreds of millions, billions every year. We have to make up a deficit. I think our power solution lies in two phases. The one is to make up the deficit very fast, so we can get the patient revived and stabilized. And the next phase is, what's the long-term cholesterol reduction plan?